Namaste and good afternoon. Welcome to a special session of NICE, where we are having the conversation with the author, Dhruva Jaishankar, who had just come with a new book, Vishwa Shastra, India and the World. Uh, Dhruva Jaishankar is the Executive Director of ORF America, who has helped establish it in 2020. He's also a non-resident fellow with the Lowy Institute in Australia and writes a regular column for the Hindustan Times. His research on India's relationship with the United States, Japan, Australia, and Southeast Asia, and Europe, defense and security policy, and globalization, democracy, and technology has been published in several books, including Vishwa Shastra, India and the World, policy reports, and publications, including foreign policy and the survival. From 2016 to 2019, Dhruva was a fellow with the Foreign Policy Studies at Brookings India in New Delhi and Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. From 2012 to 2016, he was Transatlantic Fellow with the German Marshall Fund in Washington, D.C., where he managed the India's Trilateral Forum, a regular policy dialogue involving participants from India, Europe, and the US. From 2009 to 2012, he was program officer with the Asia program at German Marshall Fund. And before that, he worked as a researcher assistant at the Brookings Institution, as I said. In 2015, he was a visiting fellow with Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He has also been a David Rockefeller Fellow with the Trilateral Commission at IISS-SAIS Merrill Center Young Strategist and a Brent Scowcroft Award Fellow with the Aspen Strategy Group. He holds bachelor's in history and classics from Macalester College and master's in security studies from Georgetown University. Once again, welcome to today's discussion. Let me start with the first question, which is on the outlook of the book. What is the significance of the book Vishwa Shastra, India and the World, and what can the reader expect from this book?
First of all, thank you, Dr. Jaiswal, for having me here. It's very nice to be engaging with this audience. I think we have a lot of people from India and Nepal, but from lots of other places, and it's I very much welcome this opportunity. This book, Vishwa Shastra, which came out last year, I have one copy here, unfortunately, which came out last year in December, about a little over 1 month ago. I wrote it I started writing it almost 8 years ago. And I felt there was a need. It changed over time. I really finished it in early 2024. But I felt there was a need for a very introductory text about India and its place in the world, both for Indians, so particularly younger Indians who wanted to know more about international relations. Many people did not necessarily have a training in that field. So this includes, people who are generalists, people, even if they come from an engineering background or law background, they should still be able to understand it, or business. So I felt there was a need for just an introductory text on India and its place in the world and its interactions with the world over time. And I also felt this would be useful for non-Indians who are trying to understand that as well. So while the book has been published only in India, I believe it's available in Nepal as well. It's not available in the US or West or Europe and places like that yet. But again, essentially it's an introduction. So the book, essentially, as I see it, does three things, which I hope people will find useful. One is it gives a history going back to ancient times, but with more emphasis on more recent events, up to 2024, of India's interactions with the world in different phases at different times. So the first chapter, quite a long chapter, is on India before independence. Then 2 chapters on the Cold War period, and then 2 chapters on the post-Cold War period after 1991. So I think partly people should know where India is coming from, and Indians themselves sometimes should know where India is coming from. The second part, which is about the last 1/3 of the book, is a section on strategy. What is India's strategy today? What are its main objectives, and what are its priorities? How is it trying to achieve those objectives? And I think you'll be pleased to see that there's one whole chapter dedicated to India's neighborhood, including a lot on Nepal. And finally, the book has at the end, about 250 other books as references for people who want to know more about a particular subject, and it's categorized by topic area. So, for example, again, on India and the neighborhood, these are, 10, 15 books to read on that, on India-US relations, 10 books to read on India-China relations, and so forth. So I hope that between that, between the history, the strategy, and the references, this serves as a good starting point for people who are interested in India's international relations.
Dhruva, like when you wrote this book, what was in your mind? Like, who was your primary audience for this Vishwa Shastra? Is it aimed at academicians, policymakers, or the general public?
That's a good question. I think all of the above. Primarily, it is meant for Indians, but and again, people who are less familiar with a lot of the details of these issues. But I think it would be equally helpful, I hope, to people from outside the country, diplomats who are coming to the country, even people outside of academics who are outside of India. It's not primarily an academic book, but it does engage with some of the big academic debates around India's international relations. I would say, it makes quite a forceful argument for what would be termed a realist approach to international relations, that India's and other countries are best served when they look at things from an interest-based point of view. So I think it very much is in that spirit. And in some ways pushes back against some of the other literature, recent academic literature that argues for other explanations of India's behavior, including some post-colonial resentment and other factors that I don't believe those primarily are what guides India's international relations today.
Uh, could you elaborate on the long tradition of India's statecraft and strategy thinking on international affairs that you discuss in your book? How have these traditions influenced modern Indian foreign policy that we see today?
So again, another issue that comes up quite often is a lot of academic literature and a lot of analysis starts with this presumption that there's no strategy, there's no method in India's international engagement, and there's also no tradition of statecraft or thinking about international relations. And what I try to show a little bit is that's not true. And again, you can go back in some cases more than 2,000 years and find writings about what Indian leaders at that time, starting with Ashoka, but even in some cases with glimpses before that, what they thought about international relations. And so there is actually quite a long tradition, even if it's a contested one, on statecraft in India, going back, and you can draw from Buddhist literature, Vedic literature, up to medieval India. And there were many times when Indian states, sometimes quite capable Indian states, were contesting with each other in India, often contesting with outsiders. So again, it's not that there's been a complete absence of statecraft or strategic thinking or writing on the subject, but for whatever reason, this is simply overlooked often in a lot of contemporary international relations literature. A
Uh,
final point of this, which I may be getting into your next question perhaps, but does this matter at all? I think yes and no. I think to some degree, Indians have sometimes forgotten their own traditions in some of these respects. So part of my intention here is to remind people of that. But I think partly it does have influence in how Indians look at the world.
like after India's independence, India has faced territorial, economic, and governance challenges. How did these challenges shape India's early foreign policy decisions, particularly concerning its rivalry with Pakistan and China that still continues today?
So, first, what was it that was preoccupying Indian leaders immediately after independence, almost sometimes before independence and certainly immediately after? Two things mostly. One was this issue of territorial integrity. That is, India was left, on August 15, 1947, it was partitioned. There were big questions about some of the princely states and their accession to India. And India used both diplomacy and force to try and consolidate that territory. And it led to questions about what kind of relationship would India have with some of its neighbors, including at that time Nepal, Bhutan, and Sikkim, all of which had treaties with the British Indian Raj. But India had to work to consolidate that and update that after independence. So I think this question of of territory and what the physical contours of India would look like was one big question for Indian leaders. The second was development. How should India modernize? What kind of relationships should it forge with particularly advanced industrialized economies? At that time, the US, Soviet Union, and Europe, um, to advance its economy. And in some ways, that heavily informed India's own economic model. Should be a mixed economy? Should it be more market friendly? Should it be more command and control, a top-down economy? So I think these were the debates, and I just give a brief survey of some of the debates around these two issues in the early years after independence, because I think they had a lasting legacy. You correctly identified two relationships I devote quite a lot of time to in the book, partly because they still remain very relevant, which are Pakistan and China, and what so the origins of India's rivalries with Pakistan and China. And what you see in both cases actually was that what we now take for granted was not necessarily how it was meant to be. So with Pakistan, for example, there were periods until 1965, between 1947 and 1965, despite the war in Jammu and Kashmir, there were periods when India and Pakistan did collaborate. And this idea that Pakistan would be a revisionist power in the way and use terrorism as a tool of state policy was not necessarily a foregone conclusion. It really changed after 1962, when Pakistan started seeing India as one of the future leaders, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, future prime ministers, called India a defeated nation. And after the 1962 China war. So the China and Pakistan dynamics were also related as well. With China, I think it was very different, which is there's a very long section in my book so I'm just describing what happened in India-China relations between 1950 and 1962. And again, it started off on a much more positive note. India was very early to recognize the People's Republic of China on negotiating on the border. In 1954, there were a series of agreements. And yet by 1962, you had war. And so I kind of recount in quite a lot of detail what led up to that. And ultimately, it led to a few things. One was just a lack of preparedness on India's part. But the other was just a misreading both of China and Chinese domestic politics and its leadership's intentions, but also a misreading of the international situation at that time. And so as a consequence, when war did break out finally in 1962, despite the fact that there were skirmishes 3 years earlier, the fact is India did not receive sufficient and timely support from either the US or the Soviet Union at that time. So it had larger consequences. So not all of this was preordained. It need not have happened that way. But I do think it's worth for Indians today to understand what is the origins of India's continuing challenges with both Pakistan and China.
Dhruva, the book likely addresses themes like diplomacy, trade, and culture exchanges. Which of these areas do you think is most critical for India's future global engagement?
I mean, the correct answer is all of them. I don't actually devote much time to cultural exchanges. I talk about some cultural exchanges in the past, particularly religious exchanges in the pre-independence era, but I don't devote a lot of time to culture. Largely, I focus on two aspects, which are security and particularly military preparedness and India's sort of security and strategic relationships. This includes in the Indo-Pacific, in West Asia, with other major powers. And then the second, somewhat related to that, is the economic and commercial relationship, although not just trade and investment. I think I try and take a more holistic approach. And essentially what I argue, I mean, the first chapter of the strategy section, which is what should India prioritize? The two things I say is India should prioritize its own military preparedness, one, and two, it should prioritize an industrial policy for its economic growth and resilience. But both of those things will require positive relationships with partner countries. That India cannot do all of that on its own. And so it's not sort of, in some ways, I also make a very strong argument against a sort of isolationist India, because I don't think periods of isolationism in the past have served India very well. So I don't, again, culture, I don't devote a lot of attention to. I mean, I personally think it's very important, but it's not something that a state or policymakers have much control over. Culture tends to flow in a very organic way. But it's not because the Indian government did anything that yoga has become so popular in the West. It became popular in the West. Belatedly, the Indian government now has seized upon it. And so again, I don't put a lot of priority on culture, but the other factors, I think trade and on the one hand, security and strategic relations, and two, economic trade, technology, human migration, that set of issues. Like, economics thought very broadly is the second set of priorities.
Thank you. You just mentioned about industrial policy. So how does Vishwa Shastra addresses the role of technology and innovation in India's global strategy?
Yeah, one of the running themes, particularly for the post-independence period, throughout, but it's accelerated and become more important more recently, but it has always been there, is the role of technology in national development. And again, really from day one, the Indian government was very interested in mastering what were then considered cutting-edge technologies, because they saw it as a means to advance the country. And this included things from agricultural techniques to nuclear sciences at that time. And today we're dealing obviously with a very different set of issues. One of the things I look at, and both positive and negative, is how in some areas India was very remarkably successful at leveraging its foreign relations to accelerate its technological its command of technology. And some of the examples I gave are just in terms of technical education, in agriculture, infrastructure, software in the 1990s, space program. So there are many positive experiences that India can draw upon, and I give how many of these things were really a consequence. They didn't happen by accident. It was a consequence of policy to seek a certain kind of assistance, technical assistance, financing from foreign partners. This includes things like the Colombo Plan, which is part of the Commonwealth, and then it was set up by the Commonwealth in the 1950s, to the Green Revolution in the 1960s, and then all the way to the software, telecom, and infrastructure boom in the 1990s and 2000s. And again, I go into some detail as to how they happen. Again, these are not accident. At the same time, the fact is India has been left behind in many other areas and has not, despite having access, some of it had to do with questions of export control and sanctions. But India, it's not just that even after India made a considerable effort to lift those sanctions, particularly after 1998, after its nuclear tests, that for a large number of reasons, it has not sufficiently done that. And so I also look at sort of in some ways, why did India miss the bus in certain areas? To give one example, we are now talking about electronics assembly and manufacturing, and there's been some success in that in the past 5 years. But in the 1970s, this was an issue, and India, in fact, had a high-level government committee on how to bolster electronics manufacturing, because at that time the concern was about importing too much from Japan. Today, the concern is importing too much from China. And yet, again, for a number of reasons, political, economic, vested interests, India missed the bus. India just did not do that. A similar thing happened with semiconductors a little bit later in the 1980s. So again, in some ways, I do think there needs to be an honest reflection as to why India has not been so successful in some areas. And yet again, there are plenty of examples of India being much more successful that India can draw upon. So it's not, I don't think everything is lost. I think that we do need to reflect on both the positive and negative lessons.
Dhruva, how does India's approach to global interaction differ from that of the other major powers, such as China or the US?
It's a good question. I don't address that explicitly because I don't compare India to other countries in the book explicitly. But I think it's a good question to ask. I think one very strange thing that I don't think gets enough attention, a lot of major powers, and this includes the US, it includes Russia, it includes China, certainly in the past included France as well, um, kind of came to power on the back of some kind of ideological revolution. You had the American Revolution that led to American independence. You had the Russian Revolution that led to the creation of the Soviet Union. You had the Chinese Revolution in 1949. And yet in India's case, it was not a revolutionary birth. It was not, yes, there was an ideological basis for the independence movement. Um, but it was not born as a revolutionary state. And so there hasn't been this need to sort of export that sense of revolution abroad. So I think that's one way in which that does explain in some ways why India, despite its many challenges, has been a more status quo-oriented power over the past 70 odd years. I think the question is, will that change a little bit over time? I don't think it will significantly, even though India's capabilities will grow. It still remains a much more status quo-oriented power than many other major large countries. So I think that's one way in which its behavior does differ, but I don't go into that in a lot of detail in the book.
Let me go to global south. Like, how do you distinguish between India's past approach of non-alignment and its current leadership of the global south being a rising power?
Mhm. Um, I do devote a whole section on the global south and both the origins of why India has sort of re-embraced the global south recently, also what it is meant to achieve from India's point of view. I do think there's some major differences from past interactions. I think, again, even though this was not the original intent of Nehru and others, India hosted even before independence in March, April of 1947, India hosted an Asian Relations Conference on which sort of trying to position itself as a leader in the post-colonial world. With delegates from all over Asia. It's quite surprising who came for that, including from what is today Myanmar, Vietnam, China, and West Asia, and Middle East as well. And again, a lot of people remember the Bandung Summit in 1950, 54, 55, the sort of spirit of Bandung, and creation of the non-aligned movement in the early 1960s. But at some point after that, it became very mired in a sort of ideological position. And I think in some ways deviated quite significantly from, even in Nehru's lifetime, from what he had originally envisioned or intended. Today, I think it's very different. I think the Global South is a very, very practical concept with, in some ways, the outlines of a very practical agenda, which is these are countries that, because of their colonial histories and because of their development histories, have been mostly marginalized in matters of global governance. So these are underrepresented countries of the world as a consequence of both their political and economic legacies. And they have a set of issues, despite their many differences, including their development profiles, their languages, their regime types, all of that. These are countries that have a set of common concerns. And these include the inequities of international institutions, questions of management of debt and sustainability, questions of sovereignty, questions of health, food, and energy security. And these were felt very acutely during the COVID pandemic and in the immediate aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions that were placed on Russia as a result of that. And then climate justice. So I think if you take a combination of these issues, climate justice, energy, health, food security, debt sustainability, and institutional reform, these are a set of issues that, no matter whether you are Bolivia or the Dominican Republic or Angola or Vietnam or India or Saudi Arabia even, you feel that these issues are not being sufficiently addressed by the powers that be, which are largely the United States and its allies on the one hand, and also Russia and China on the other. So I think that this is very much what the contours of a global South agenda look like. These happen to be things that India wants to advance as well for its own quite selfish self-interest. But the fact is you have 100, 150 other countries that also agree with you. So it makes sense from India's point of view to build that coalition, to harness some of those voices from the global south in a bid to advocate for the kind of change that India wants to see. So again, I would not look at it in sort of woolly-headed ideological terms. I think there's a very practical agenda that India wants to advance in a bid with the ultimate objective of reforming international institutions and advancing what are some collective shared interests of the global south.
Dhruva, have you also covered the case of SAARC? As we are aware that the SAARC meeting has not been held since 2011 due to bilateral conflict between India and Pakistan. So does India see the future of SAARC or has it particularly terminated?
Mm-hmm. So I think I do mention SAARC, and there's a section on regionalism in South Asia and in India's neighborhood, and it also goes a little bit into the history of how SAARC came to be and what both its benefits and its shortcomings. I think the issue, when SAARC was really initially proposed by Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, as a bid into advance regionalism in South Asia. And both India and Pakistan had their hesitations about SAARC. India was worried about being hemmed in by a lot of the other countries together, and essentially Pakistan taking advantage of that, whereas Pakistan saw this as a bit of cornering Pakistan and India using its relations with the other countries to push Pakistan on certain issues. What ended up happening was two things. One is, I think SAARC agreed, probably wisely, to focus more on certain technical areas. So despite the summits, SAARC still does, I think, very important work in terms of educational technical exchanges, in terms of meteorological data, things like that. And again, there remains a secretariat in Kathmandu, as many of you will know, for SAARC. But the other thing that I think was agreed at the time, much like ASEAN, was that the agenda would be set by consensus. So you had to have all members agree to actually accomplish something. And what I think grew over time was that India found that Pakistan was blocking a lot of initiatives, including initiatives that seemed pretty harmless and not, intended with any kind of strategic impulse. But as a result, I think that there was a growing feeling in New Delhi that essentially Pakistan was holding India's regional integration efforts hostage. And I think the breaking point, actually, I think it was a summit in 2014, 2015 in Kathmandu, actually, where India proposed a SAARC satellite, amongst other things, and Pakistan blocked that on very flimsy grounds. And India decided to then go ahead with it without Pakistan and call it a South Asia satellite. But I think that summit, and essentially what became quite clear, I think, to Prime Minister Modi at that time was Pakistan was not willing to be cooperative, again, even on some very minor, mundane issues. And so as a result, I think we've seen SAARC take a back seat, unfortunately. Again, I'm not saying it's completely moribund. It remains relevant in certain areas. But India is also investing in other regional institutions at the same time, including bilateral initiatives, things like BBIN, also with Nepal, BIMSTEC, again, which includes Nepal. So I think the idea is to go ahead with South Asian integration, advance the agenda, not hold it hostage to one party because of the design of SAARC. Now, what does this mean for the future? I suspect SAARC will continue working at that low level. In recent years, I haven't seen this year, but in even the recent past, India's budget for SAARC remains, but it is matched by its budget for BIMSTEC. So it's quite a clear indication that India is also investing in other equally, and in some cases more, in other institutions. The BIMSTEC charter was revised so that it has now a clearer agenda. It has a secretariat also in Dhaka. So I think we're going to see SAARC is not going to go away, but it completely. It may not meet at the summit level with as much frequency, but some of the technical work will continue. But I think India will in parallel invest in many other regional institutions to advance the agenda it has tried to advance for some time.
Dhruva, when we look at India's neighborhood at the moment, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and China were not exemplary examples for best relations. But Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Maldives was seen as a successful stories. But at the moment, apart from Bhutan, I mean, we're not having a good relation. So with neighborhood policy weakening, particularly in South Asia, what next strategy or move do you suggest to the policymakers in New Delhi?
So first of all, I think people, there's a lot of, there's a question I get quite often, and there's a lot of analysis on which is motivated, I think, just only by very recent events. And I think people forget even the recent past, sometimes what the challenges were. I actually think the neighborhood first is strengthening, not weakening. In fact, it's and I think there's much to show for it. So again, the broader direction I think is quite positive, and I'll explain why. One is I think we sort of underestimate some of the challenges that India had with its neighbors in the past. And I go into quite a lot of detail, in the 1950s, 1960s, 1980s. In fact, in some ways, the 70s and 80s were a very difficult time for India's relationship with its neighbors. This was when India intervened in Sri Lanka. We had, this is the first protests in the late 1980s in Nepal. I think we forget sometimes how troubled sometimes the neighborhood relationships were. There were challenges with Bangladesh at that time as well. India intervened in a coup in Maldives in 1988. So again, it was sometimes very troubled period in the past. Even in the past 10 years, 15 years, there's been some difficulties, again, with almost all of India's neighbors. That being said, I think there's a question, and I devote a whole chapter to this. One is I think Indians must recognize that there's some big changes happening in their neighborhood, including in Nepal, and political changes. And we're seeing, countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, opening up in many ways. They're becoming the political space has opened up significantly. They're democratizing. You have more voices in the public domain, online, in the media. And also, these are countries that are very naturally are sensitive to their sovereignty. So we have, again, growing democratization, sovereignty consciousness, nationalism rising in Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka. This is going to happen. It's happening in India as well. It's happening everywhere. When this happens, I think beyond a point, there's very little India can and should do to dictate how these countries should run themselves. These are sovereign countries. They will choose their own leaders. And part of what will happen is we'll see these swings in leadership where you will have leaders who are branded correctly or otherwise pro-India and others who are branded anti-India. And again, the reality is always going to be more complex than that, these black and white narratives that we see in the press. But the fact is we're going to have political changes in all of these countries. Despite that, the challenge over time is how do we stabilize the economic and social relations with these countries. And again, if you look at what has happened, you continue to have an open border between India and Nepal, something you don't see between two countries anywhere. Bangladesh has become the largest destination of Indian state-backed investment, including in infrastructure. There's been a settlement on the boundary. Sri Lanka remains is the largest recipient of lending, state-backed lending by India, particularly after the financial crisis there a few years ago. And so I think that, again, leaders in all of these countries, and Maldives and Sri Lanka are good recent examples of this, realize now that for their own benefit, they have to work with India to some extent. That doesn't mean that they will do, their preferences will always align with Indian preferences, but they do have to work with India. And I think the leadership, the visits by the leaders of Sri Lanka and Maldives recently to India underscore that importance, even though one belongs to a party that was historically more skeptical of India, and one campaigned on a very explicitly anti-India and India out platform. So I expect, again, we'll see that stabilizing of relationship over time, but this will coexist with a kind of political volatility that is really up to the domestic dynamics of these countries. I think for India, the only two things that matter really, one is that it's why these countries. Part of the reason why these countries are so important for India and should be more important for India is just the reality that we have overlapping ethnicities, we have kinship ties across countries. And so what happens in Sri Lanka matters in Tamil Nadu, especially in Tamil Nadu. What happens in Bangladesh matters in West Bengal and Assam. What happens in Nepal matters in UP and Bihar. And so that's a very real issue. Second is, I think, the countries themselves, Kathmandu, Dhaka, Colombo, Male, all also need to be sensitive to Indian security concerns as well. And so I do think there needs to be this two-way understanding. And partly what I recommend is, I think on India's part, I think we need to invest much more in area studies focused on the neighborhood, because it does not get sufficient attention. So again, I try very much to put the neighborhood front and center and make it a priority in India's relations.
Dhruva, we have lots of questions on Nepal-India ties. So how do you look at Nepal-India ties? How has it evolved with time, and how important is China factor here?
I mean, Nepal is very uniquely positioned, right? Because it is a landlocked country. It has two neighbors, both of which are very big countries, China and India. And it's natural that Nepal should have relations with both China and India. I think, again, over time, I go into this, I think we overlook some of the difficulties of the past. And India and Nepal had differences about China in the 1960s and again in the 1980s. So I think it's worth revisiting that, because these are not new problems per se. But again, I think two things to think about. I think in Nepal, my limited interactions with my Nepali counterparts and colleagues suggest that sometimes they see a sort of opportunism in relations with China, without actually maybe understanding what Beijing's motivations are, and or seeing through. So I think, this temptation to use China as a card for better leverage with India, which is very tempting. I think there's a danger to that, because I think there are concerns about the actual terms of lending, for example, from India to other countries. And I think, again, Nepal should just draw from look at the experiences of Pakistan, look at the experiences of Sri Lanka. So just from, I would say this not just purely from an analytical point of view, that it's what are countries that have successfully leveraged an economic relationship with Nepal and have come out of it, particularly in the long term, most stronger and successful. And unfortunately, the list is not very long. It's really mostly resource-heavy countries that have done so. Many others have, again, Pakistan and Sri Lanka are two good examples where when you read the fine print on some of the contracts and agreements with China, these are not free. And so there will be these costs, and sometimes they'll come out, we'll find out about this 5-10 years from now. So I think the terms of lending, and I know this has been a domestic political debate in Nepal, particularly between the Nepali Congress and some of the other parties, on what are the terms of engagement in terms of lending. At the same time, I think there's also this risk that Nepal and other countries do of being dragged into the security competition between India and China. And that's, again, not something I would think Nepal would want to happen. So again, different countries have tried to deal with it different ways. One easy way of doing it is just transparency. If there is an investment in major infrastructure, that assurances, and not just assurances, that it's quite clear that this is not used for any kind of military purpose. That's a way of ensuring that Nepal can maximize the benefits of a relationship with both India and China. Because again, Nepal will have a relationship with China, particularly an economic relationship. It's only natural for its neighbors. But doing so in a manner that essentially sustainable from Nepal's point of view, financially sustainable, environmentally sustainable, benefits actually Nepali, creates employment in Nepal. That's one issue. And then secondly, does not exacerbate security competition. I think that seems to me to be a very the way forward. And so I think, again, learning from others' experiences would be beneficial. But again, in many countries, and this is not unique to Nepal, there's sometimes a tendency on the part of leaders to be a little bit to look only short term, look at what the short term advantages are, see these relations as leverage to be used against other parties. And again, in most cases, that eventually comes back to bite the country's interests.
Dhruva, I'm sure you have not answered this, covered this in your book, but like lots of questions on the future, like where do you see India, China heading during Trump 2.0, and what will be the relationship of Nepal, India and US during the Trump 2.0? Lots of questions on this. So maybe if you'd like to answer, what is India's engagement?
Yeah, thank you. No, I do cover the future. as well. But this was written before Trump's election, but it's not, excuse me, it's not specific to Trump. So I still think a lot of it applies. What I anticipate, excuse me, what I anticipate is long-term competition between India and China, and separately between the US and China, uh, for a number of structural factors. And I get into it, and largely it has to do with the nature of Chinese leadership, at least under the People's Republic of China. It has to do with the nature of its economy and some of the structural realities of its economy. And it has to do with its self-conception as a major power. And as a consequence of that, some of the revisionism it is attempting in the Pacific on the one hand, which will involve the US, and in the Himalayas on the other, which will involve India. And so as a consequence of this, I think we can anticipate a period of long-term structural competition between the US and China on the one hand, and between India and China on the other. What the exact tenor of that competition will take will change. It'll depend on multiple factors. There will be periods where relations will seem better, and there will be periods where relations will seem worse. But as a consequence of that, I think we are going to be in for a period then of a growing and converging US-India partnership. And I think we're seeing that even now, which is despite the many other changes that Trump is sweeping in. We're seeing he'll have a meeting next week in Washington with Prime Minister Modi. And I think there's every expectation that the relationship with India is one that will continue to build up in a positive direction. So I think again, I think maybe it's because I'm sort of biased in the structural way, and I've tried to look at things with the broad sweep, but I just see very few options for this broad dynamic changing fundamentally. Will there be periods again of cooling temperatures? Yes, and sort of attempts at trying to normalize relations more to manage that competition, certainly. But the overall direction will be a much more competitive one between both India and China, and the US and China.
Thank you so much. We hardly have 5 to 7 minutes. Let me take 2 or 3 questions. First, as US has stopped, or it might stop foreign aid in most of the developing countries, where many of the vital projects, such as in healthcare, are halted, how India views this opportunity in terms of bilateral aid in the developing country?
This is the Trump suspension of aid, correct?
Yes. So how do you
Yeah.
think this opportunity?
So directly, India is not very much affected because India doesn't receive that much aid from the US. And mostly it's in one area, which is in healthcare. It's to advance, on HIV and on other things. The US has global programs, including in India. So that is what, at least directly, that is what is most directly being affected. I think a lot of the criticism is that aid is one tool. It's maybe not the best or the only tool for international influence. This is what countries do to compete with each other, is they extend aid. And if this is one area where the US is abdicating that space, that will naturally have consequences for many others. In some cases, others, perhaps China, perhaps the European Union in some ways, will try and fill that void. But there are many other places, because of their own problems at home, the EU, Japan, China, Russia, India all have limited resources. So the idea that they can completely replace the US in many respects, it won't happen. There's some attempts now in some areas for the private sectors hoping to step in. So like philanthropy is financed by people like Michael Bloomberg and Bill Gates are trying to step in some areas to offset the US drawdown in foreign assistance. But again, it will be only in a few specific areas that matter. For Bloomberg, it's climate. For Gates, it's health. But again, this will have some longer term consequences. So I think I'm a bit of an aid skeptic personally. I don't think aid is often the best wisely spent or is the most effective tool for development. But that being said, it will have these consequences. And the biggest concern I would have would be on global health initiatives, especially.
Let me take one last question. Do you think India's withdrawal from RCEP, Regional comprehensive economic partnership has been a wise decision in terms of economic growth and trade security?
Yeah, so I actually devote a section on that. In fact, in the decision around India's withdrawal from RCEP. I think one a little bit of background. I think partly we're in a world which is very different. We are no longer in this world of the 1990s and early 2000s, which was one of essentially lowering of global trade barriers, a liberalization and harmonization of standards across the globe, both at a multilateral level and a regional level, which led to this massive growth of trade and globalization around the world. That really came to an end, I would say, in 2008, but certainly there was other developments after 2008 that contributed to that. Today, we're in a very different era. We're in an era where jobs are highly sought after. There's competition in different economies for employment at home. And there's competition particularly for manufacturing. And this is leading to, in some ways, a series of competing industrial policies. China has a massive industrial policy, which has enabled it to become a manufacturing powerhouse. It now accounts for about 35% of global manufacturing, which is incredibly high. Meanwhile, there are concerns about deindustrialization in the European Union. The US is adjusting, in fact, a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the US's economic policies, whether it's the withdrawal from trade agreements, the use of tariffs, it's domestic attempts at building up a domestic manufacturing base, massive subsidies. This is all a reflection of this new reality. So for India, I think there was this question on RCEP that came up, which is, should India integrate further on, and this is just on goods trade, with ASEAN, with China, with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and others. And I think the calculation in the end was that this would not serve India well, that this would actually, India is not competitive, at least in manufacturing relative to these economies. It would actually hold back India's industrialization efforts. And so India made this decision to not participate in the conclusion of the RCEP agreements. Instead, what we've seen is a pivot, if you will, to India exploring and in some cases concluding trade agreements with mostly advanced industrial economies, which India believes are more complementary for its own efforts at industrialization. So India's finalized 4 agreements since withdrawing from RCEP, which are with Mauritius, UAE, Australia, and EFTA, which is 4 European countries, and has restarted negotiations with the European Union and UK. And in fact, even had negotiations with Canada underway before some of the political differences emerged last year. So I think this is basically part of a new trade strategy, which is aligned with the new industrial strategy, which is essentially to focus on markets which are not direct competitors of India, and where there are these complementarities. And I think partly what we'll see happen over the next few, perhaps even in the next week, is India exploring. This is not going to be a major trade agreement, but a sort of phase 1, a tentative trade agreement of some kind, just to provide stability with the US even. So that, I think, is part of the approach. So again, I would not look at the RCEP withdrawal as in isolation. I think the concern was, there were very specific concerns, which were what India wanted out of RCEP on issues like services and mobility were sidelined, were completely ignored in the negotiations, particularly by the ASEAN countries. And then the second sort of big issue was that rules of origin, India considered them too lax and was worried about China exploiting that for dumping into the Indian market. And in fact, we've seen examples of China doing precisely that, including with the US recently. So that was really the concern, that it would lead to, it would actually, while it might benefit consumers in the short term, it would really come at the cost of Indian industry over the longer run.
Thank you, Dhruva. Thank you so much for your time. It was wonderful talking to you. We still have lots of questions, but we have to wrap up today's discussion. We are really thankful to all our wonderful participants who have shared their questions. Please join us to our next session next time. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
Thank you.